So today what we're going to look at is imperialism outside of Africa, mainly the Middle East, which I guess sort of includes Northern Africa. So we're going to have a little bit of Africa in here, but uh, the Middle East and Eastern Asia, that would be primarily China and Japan. Okay, so there were three Muslim so-called gunpowder empires. From west to east, you've got the Ottomans, the Safavids in Persia, Iran, and the Mughals in India. And they're called gunpowder empires because they had adopted the use of gunpowder weapons from China fairly early on. And those played a key role, not the only role. It's not the only reason why they were able to build their empires, but they play a key role in the development of their empires. And so that's why they get called that. Um, but they've got problems. Their central government is not well liked and not very powerful. The further away you get from the capital, the less authority the emperor will have. There's widespread corruption. They're going to have conflicts with, and military conflicts to some degree, with local landowners and military elites. Some areas are essentially self-governing. Egypt in the Ottoman Empire is a great example. Was essentially self-governing. It was part of the Ottoman Empire in name only, really. Then they also have to contend with a couple of Islamic fundamentalist reform movements. One of them, the Wahhabi movement, wants to purify Islam. The Wahhabists still exist, and they are one of the groups largely responsible for the political terrorists of the Islamic faith. Luckily, it's a relatively small percentage of Muslims are Wahhabists, even now, but they are there and they're very spread by the fire and sword kind of folks. Uh, and then the other reform movement that they're going to have to deal with is the Mahdi. And the Mahdi he's a self-proclaimed Mahdi. It's basically he's sort of a successor to the prophet who had been foretold centuries before, and this man claims to be that person, that figure that was expected. And he's from the Sudan, south of Egypt, and he'll lead the Mahdist rebellion in the 1880s and early 90s. This is going to lead to a war with Egypt, which the Mahdists win, and then with Britain, which they lose. Um, Partly because the Mahdi dies during the war with Britain, not because of the war. He actually gets sick. Um, he gets sick and he dies. And then his followers, they split up. The most powerful of them continues to fight the British and is defeated several times. I believe the two biggest battles he fights against them are at Omdurman and Tel El Kabir. One of the people at Omdurman, interestingly, is a very young man named Winston Churchill, who we will hear a lot about later on. Very interesting fellow. And this is just a quick map of the so-called gunpowder empires. The Ottoman Empire, which actually stretches a little bit further to the west, the Safavid Persian Empire, and the Mughal Empire, which, if you recall, were Muslim Mongols ruling in India. And so the Ottomans in particular are having lots and lots of problems. By this point, the Ottoman Empire is considered sort of the weak old man of Europe. They used to be big, bad, and scary. Now they're something of a laughing stock. There are national revolts being led by local pashas all over the place, in Armenia, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Egypt, Romania, and so on and so on and so on. And they're not just revolting, they're winning. There is pressure from European countries. The French and the Italians see several North African provinces, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, across the northern part of Africa there. And within, they have some westernized Turks. These are people who are trained and educated in a Western European style. And they look at the industrialized, for the era, liberal policies of the West, and they want to repeat that in that wealth and success in Turkey. And the group is known as the Young Turks because they're mostly young men. And they overthrow the Sultan in 1908, leading to the rule by three men known as the three Pashas. The most important of them is Enver Pasha. And these three men will rule until 1918, when the Ottoman Empire is broken up at the end of World War I. Egypt is especially important because it had already become basically a semi-independent province under Ali Pasha, which is Muhammad Ali. And he was appointed the governor in 1805, and he started to modernize Egypt. He used Western advisors to improve their military. He armed them with, I believe they were French supplied guns. He improved things like tax collection. He reorganized land holding, backed new irrigation projects to make more of Egypt arable land where you could farm. He did a lot to improve Egypt. After he dies, however, one of the things he was very good at was playing the European powers off against each other. After he dies, however, Egypt is going to become more and more under European influences. They will build the canal at Suez, which is a really important economic link because it links the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean and thereby the Atlantic without having to go all the way around Africa. This is a savings of weeks by steamship, which means a money savings too. Remember, time is money, right? The canal is actually built by the French. An engineer named de Lesseps, Ferdinand de Lesseps, is the engineer that builds it in a deal with Egypt. Then the British start investing in it to help finish it. And then they buy out the Egyptian shares. The British government buys out the Egyptian shares, giving them control over the canal. They end up owning the majority of the canal, and so they end up actually buying the rest of it from France too. But it was for that canal that Britain really got interested in Egypt because that provides a link to the Raj of India. So now we move to India, the Indian Raj, which basically means kingdom or empire. This is the jewel in the crown of the British Empire is how it's been described because it was absolutely the single most valuable colony that Britain had, or really probably anybody had. The British presence in India begins with the development of a company known as the Honorable East India Company, and sometimes just called the Company or John Company. And it was established in 1600, so way before all this, to establish British trade with India. It holds a virtual monopoly on that trade. And the primary thing that they're bringing from India is tea. They bring other things, spices and cottons and things like that. But the number one thing that they're bringing from India to Britain is tea. And they bring a lot of it. It is the Honorable East India Company that is the focus of the Tea Act, which was the law that the American colonists protested with the Boston Tea Party because it established a monopoly, essentially, on the sale of tea in the colonies. And so they've got a virtual monopoly on trade with them. To protect their interests, the EIC builds their own armies. They actually build 3 separate armies of sepoys. Now, sepoys are native Indian troops who are trained and led by European officers, trained in European tactics, armed with European weapons, and basically they will whoop up on any of the locals, given even close to parity in numbers, because of their improved discipline and tactics, mainly. Has nothing to do with their bravery. But they will, over time, begin to add more and more of India under the influence of the EIC, under the company. The company also had what amounted to its own navy to protect their ships going to and from Britain to India. During the 7 Years' War, these Sepoy troops, under the command of a man named Robert Clive, who is better known as Clive of India, will defeat the French, basically giving Britain free reign in India. And by 1857, just about 100 years later, the EIC will control 60% of India directly. Now, India is huge, y'all. It is a subcontinental system. It's immense. So 60% of India is a lot. They did some good things. They did some bad things. They introduced Western schools, medicine, religion, and justice systems. They start building railroads. They weaken the caste system. They get rid of slavery. They outlaw sati, if you recall that practice. It's the EIC that will outlaw that. They do a lot that's good for India, but they also take and take and take from India. Just vast amounts of wealth coming out of India during this era, and really the entire colonial period, which is what makes the Indian Raj such a valuable property for the British Empire, is the just insane amounts of wealth and resources and markets and things that India provides to Britain. Now, one thing that the British were not really good at was treating anyone as their equals. Very arrogant about that. Same viewpoint many people have about Americans now, because Britain was such a powerful and wealthy nation. But in 1857, what's going to happen is that sepoys of one of the three armies, the Army of Bengal, stationed in the city of Meerut, mutiny, and they kill their officers and the families. Now, a lot of it has to do with the fact that discipline in these armies was brutal. Also brutal in European armies at the time, so not uncommon. Things like floggings were still pretty common. There were a lot of things that they were unhappy about, but the final spark is the issuance of new cartridges for their guns. And now these are muzzle-loading guns still, and to load them, you bit off the end of a paper cartridge and poured the powder down, and then loaded the bullet down the muzzle and shoved it down with a ramrod, which we've talked about before. These new cartridges are supposedly greased with beef and pork fat for waterproofing. Here's the problem. This army, the sepoys, are generally, like almost all of them, are one of two religions. They're either Hindu or Muslims. Hindus believe the cow is a sacred animal. To consume beef fat is a terrible sacrilege to them. Muslims think pork is unclean, and so to consume pork was a terrible sacrilege for them. So the rumor that the company has intentionally greased their cartridges with beef and pork fat for the purpose of waterproofing means that the soldiers believe that they're being forced to give up their religion, which they don't want to do. They're basically being forced to do that. And so they refuse to use the new bullets. When they refuse to use the new bullets, they are punished. And they decide, we're not going to be punished for this, and that's why they rise up. The fact of the matter is, they were greased with neither beef nor pork. They had used mutton fat, sheep fats, to waterproof the cartridges, because they knew that the Muslims and the Hindus would not put something with beef or pork fat into their mouth. And so, but the rumor gets started. There's already a lot of unrest, and so this is going to lead to the mutiny. And once they mutiny, it's on, because mutinies are put down violently. They always have been. The mutiny is going to spread all the way across northern and central India. Hundreds of British civilians are massacred. uh, treated in very cruel ways, bodies mutilated, tortured to death, um, suffocated, packed into rooms that were. Look up the Black Hole of Calcutta, and you should look that up because I might ask a question about it later. Look it up online. The Black Hole of Calcutta, or Kolkat, Kolkata, is the modern spelling of it, but it used to be Calcutta. The Black Hole of Calcutta. Um, the mutiny spreads all the way across. Hundreds and hundreds of British civilians are massacred. The British Army comes in and they quickly and ruthlessly crush the mutiny and punished many, many Indians, both the guilty and the innocent. Because they're being so brutal, they actually drive more people into the arms of the mutiny. But the mutineers, I mean, they're killing people who help the Europeans. They're killing every European they can get their hands on. It's really, really bad. Um, on the other hand, some Indians were helpful to the Europeans. There were Indians who risked their lives to hide, for example, European women and children so that they wouldn't be killed by the mutineers and the mutineers' families and things. Uh, and so it's just total chaos. It was such a big deal that they mutinied that there were people 60, 100 years later carrying letters of recommendation written for their grandparents and great grandparents by people who had survived the mutiny because of their family's help. And they would use those as letters of recommendation to get jobs in the British Empire well into the 1930s, 40s. So the British Army comes in and they defeat with the help of a bunch of loyal Indians, a bunch of loyal sepoys. They defeat the Indian mutineers and punish them. One of the common punishments for captured mutineers, people that could be proven or just suspected of having been actually sepoys in the army of Bengal, was to blow them from the guns, which literally means they strapped you across the mouth of a cannon and fired the cannon with you tied across it, which of course blows you up into pieces and scatters you all over the place. It's violent, it's gross, it's scary, and that's the point. It is supposed to be scary. Um, as a result of the mutiny, two long-lasting things happen. The most important is the passage of the Government of India Act of 1858, which is that the British government will take over officially control of India from the EIC, because the EIC had failed to control the mutiny. And the secondary one is that from then on, the Army of India is no longer allowed cannons. They still have armies in India. Indian troops would fight in both world wars in aid of the British, but they didn't have artillery of their own. They had to get the British to help with that. So it's a much lesser thing, because the point is they just never fully trusted those Indian troops again. And so we enter the period where they actually call it the Raj, the Izzat of the Raj, the honor of the ruled place, the honor of the kingdom, the empire. Technically, not empire until 1876, when Queen Victoria will be given the title Empress of India. But after 1858, the British will rule India. They use a viceroy system, where a viceroy governs in the name of Her Majesty the Queen, or His Majesty the King, after Victoria dies in 1901. Here, what we see is British officials hold all the top positions in the government and the military, and Western style educated, or even actually Western educated, if they had the money, they would send their children off to England, to Oxford and Cambridge and schools like that, if they had bright children with money in the family, to be trained, to be educated, to make the right connections and friends, and have the right manners and all of those sorts of things. Anyway, so that sort of young Indian middle and upper class would hold the lower positions in the civil service and the military. They could become officers in Indian regiments, but they always served under higher levels of European, British officers. They still used sepoys to fill the ranks of the Indian Army, and they always kept some purely British regiments in India from then on, just in case, because the mutiny was neither forgotten nor ever truly forgiven.
You men are not under arrest, thanks to Mr. Kipling here, who happens to be a genuine correspondent for the Northern Star. But both of you richly deserve to be in jail. I have your records before me. There's everything in them, from smuggling to swindling to receiving stolen goods to barefaced blackmail.
Sir, I resent the accusation of blackmail. It is blackmail to obtain money by threats of publishing information in a newspaper. But what blackmail is there in accepting a small retainer for keeping it out of a newspaper?
And how did you propose to keep it out?
By telling the editor what I know about his sister and a certain government official in these parts.
Let him put that in his paper if he has need of news.
It would have been wiser if you'd both gone home at the end of your army service.
Home to what? A porter's uniform outside a restaurant? And tanner tips from belching civilians for closing cab doors on them and their blousy women?
Not for us, thank you. Not after watching Afghans come howling down out of the hills and taking battlefield command when all the officers had copped it.
Well said, Brother Dravett.
There may be no criminal charges against you, but I'll see these files reach Calcutta with the recommendation that you be deported as political undesirables. Detriments to the dignity of the Empire and the Izzat of the Raj.
Detriments, you call us? Detriments? Well, I want to remind you it was detriments like us that built this bloody empire and the Izzat of the bloody Raj. Hats on. About turn. Line to left. Quick march. Left. Turn.
Like all colonies, India served two primary economic functions. They were both a market and a source of materials. There were hundreds of millions of people living in India at the time, most of them desperately poor, so they weren't buying a lot of British goods. But when you multiply even a tiny amount out by hundreds of millions, it becomes a lot of money. And they have an important source of materials, particularly tea and cotton to a lesser degree, other spices besides tea, and a material called jute, J-U-T-E, which is a fiber that is made to used to make ropes and things like that. The trade, as usual, was not equal and was absolutely in favor of the metropole, in this case, Britain. So while India did give lots and lots of wealth to Britain, they got some benefits as well. It wasn't entirely one-sided. It just wasn't all economic. For one thing, they got peace between the various regions of India, who had always historically fought wars against one another. Under the British aren't putting up with that nonsense, and so they don't allow that. The British built a widespread rail network, which economically, socially, and physically helps to tie India together instead of it being a bunch of warring rival states. They developed the telegraph. They expand the postal system, so now communication through India is easier. They improve medicine. They build hospitals. The British built hospitals. They trained thousands of local people to become doctors and nurses, taught them how to make new and better medicines. They provided a fairer legal system, which largely ignores the rules of castes that the Indians had always had, had for thousands of years had. And it wasn't entirely fair. Okay, we have to admit that if you were richer, or socially higher up, you had privileges and rights, really, although legally maybe not, but in actuality, you really had an advantage in the law. But at least what you were born isn't as big a deal. And they built schools. They built lots and lots of schools, both military, civil service, medical, universities, agricultural schools. Lots and lots of schools get built across to India to teach the children, to raise them to be more productive members of the Indian Raj society. British views on India's culture were split. Most British were arrogant, self-centered, absolutely certain that Britain was the epitome of civilization, class, style, culture, everything. And so they dismissed India as inferior and Indians themselves as inferior. And this is all tied in with good old social Darwinism and racism and all of those lovely, terrible things that were so common back then. Some, however, were very interested and become intrigued by the ancient Indian philosophies and literature, studying it, translating it, learning the languages, and really immersing themselves in the cultures, because many British lived there their entire lives. They're known as Anglo-Indians, people who were English or British, but from India, born there, raised there, lived there, worked there, the whole 9 yards. There were some British that were born, raised, and died there, never left. If you were wealthier, then you typically sent your children home to England, live with relatives for a while to be schooled. Once you got to be about 10 or 11 or so, you would go back to England until probably about the age of 17 or 18, and then you would come back out to India often, because there were a lot of opportunities in India, especially for jobs for men, in the military, in the government. India's huge number of government officials, but also just all the other stuff that served the British community, which was, the government and the military too. Anyway, some people that were British even adopted Indian customs in their personal lives. They became Hindu, not many. They started wearing Indian clothing, eating Indian foods, taking Indian wives, sometimes more than one, which was an Indian custom. This is known as going native, and that was not a respectable sort of thing. It was the sort of thing that people back in England would sort of cluck their tongues over, tisk tisk sort of thing. On the other view, upper class Indians were very impressed by the British, and many of them do adopt British ways. They look at the British as, hey, these guys have taken over most of the world. They got to be doing something right. Let's check into this. Let's be like them. The only way to move up in society or get a decent job was to learn English, so they start learning English. They start following British customs. They play British sports. Cricket is huge in India. It's a massively popular game in India. As a matter of fact, it's probably there are probably more Indians playing cricket than British. Excuse me. And so they adopt British customs and become westernized. Other Indians accepted their rule, but kept most of their own traditions. And it goes largely by wealth. The wealthier you were, the more likely you were to act like the British. That's partly because the more you acted like the British, the easier it was to get good jobs, influential contacts, things like that, and make money. So it sort of ties together. The poorer you were, the more likely it was that you had little to no contact with the British in the first place. But these attempts to maintain their own traditions, even while accepting British rule, are going to help spur Indian nationalism in the late 19th and through the 20th centuries. While we are talking about India and the British Empire, I want to mention this fellow here. This is Rudyard Kipling, the poet of empire. Kipling was born in Bombay. He's Anglo-Indian, like we discussed before. His parents were English, but he was born in India. He was educated in England, okay, all very typical. Before returning to India, he becomes a journalist when he returns, working for, he's editor and reporter and all-around guy in charge of a newspaper known as the Northern Star, which is actually mentioned in the film clip and is discussed in the film and the book, The Man Who Would Be King, which he wrote. He wrote poetry, he wrote books. Probably the most famous work he has that you would be familiar with is the Jungle Book stories of Mowgli and Bagheera and Baloo the bear and everything. He wrote those. He also wrote Rikki Tikki Tavi, if you've ever seen that. He wrote Gunga Din and The Man Who Would Be King and Kim and Just So Stories and just lots and lots and lots of stories and poems. His work is unabashedly pro-empire. He was jingoistic as heck. Jingoistic is a term meaning just incredibly loudly pro in favor of something to the point of almost mindlessness about it. He especially noted the work of soldiers in his poems and tales. And one of his that I am particularly fond of is called Tommy. Now, Tommy Atkins is a nickname for a British soldier. And so the first stanza of the poem goes like this. I went into a public house to get a pint of beer. The publican he up and says, we serve no redcoats here. The girls behind the bar, they laughed and giggled fit to die. I outs into the street again, and to myself says I, oh, it's Tommy this and Tommy that and Tommy go away. But it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. The band begins to play, my boys, the band begins to play. Oh, it's thank you, Mr. Atkins, when the band begins to play. Okay, so that's just the first part of it. And it's showing how, in the time, common soldiers weren't very well respected, okay? And they weren't. They were a step up from gutter trash, but not much of a step up until there was a war on or somebody needed them. And that's what this poem is really about. That's when the band begins to play. The band plays when they're going to march off to fight. And then it's, oh, they're heroes, right? And so anyway, big fan of Rudyard Kipling's. And if you see this is an actual photo of him. He looks a lot like they did a good job picking the actor who played the character of Rudyard Kipling in the movie clip. Okay, so I mentioned Indian nationalism a moment ago. These are the people who want India to be ruled by Indians and begin to resist largely peacefully, the rule of India by, well, non-Indians really, but in this case it's the British in particular because it's the British who are kind of running the show there. So two groups, the Indian National Congress, which is the more respectable of them, that's made up of upper-class, Western-educated Indian nationalists, mostly Hindu. They used peaceful protests. They looked for legal remedies and were trying to convince the British to allow India to slowly take over gradual self-rule. They wanted a Western-style democracy. They want modernization. So they love a lot of the benefits that the British had brought to India, and they wanted to keep those things. They simply wanted to rule themselves and not be ruled by people who were not as much like them, you know, generally of a different faith. There's the whole race issue. There's the fact that London is, you know, thousands of miles away, and so you know, what's best for India is not necessarily what's best for the British, and the British always choose themselves over India. So, you know, there's some self-interest involved in it too. The other organization is known as the Muslim League. They're a little bit more violent. They typically are not as high social class. They're not as often upper class. They were created in response to the Hindu domination of the INC. They want the same things, largely. They want they want self-rule. They want to keep the advantages that they've gotten. But what they really, really want is a separate Muslim state. They don't really want to be part of India. And that's because there are a lot more Hindus than there are Muslims in India. And they felt that a Hindu-dominated government would oppress them, which they had had issues with before, to be honest. That had been an issue. Eventually, this is going to cause, in the future, in the 1900s, the split of India into India and Pakistan, where Pakistan up in the north, which was mostly Muslim, becomes a Muslim state, and basically all the Hindus leave Pakistan, and most of the Muslims in India leave India and go to Pakistan. So they sort of swap places. It is not as peaceful as people would have liked, and the Pakistanis and the Indians to this day really don't care for each other much. And both of them have nuclear weapons. So they've got that going for them. Okay, so let's keep moving to the east. And so now we're going to go and talk about China and a little bit about Japan later, and Western imperialism. And it's going to start off with opium, and we're going to end up with boxers here in China. Up until the 19th century, European merchants were very limited in China, and that included the British. China would sell tea and silks to the West, to Europeans, for gold and silver, but they bought almost nothing from Western merchants. To the Chinese, basically, European goods were just not things they were interested in, or they believed that they were poorly made or crude or whatever it was. They were inferior products. And of course, that partly comes from the Chinese belief that they were the center of the universe, of culture and civilization, and everyone else was barbarians. And of course, what could a bunch of British English barbarians give to the Celestial Kingdom, which was one of their nicknames for China? It's also known as the Middle Kingdom, as in the center of the world, Chongguo. So while gold and silver is pouring into China, buying the tea and the silk and all of that stuff that Europeans wanted and British wanted, they would buy almost nothing out. And so all of the money is going into China. This is a situation which we face somewhat now. So this is a really kind of an interesting thing. In the late 1700s, however, British merchants did find a product in India for which the Chinese absolutely would pay. That substance is opium, the drug, made from poppies, and it has some medicinal use. Okay, they use it to make, for example, morphine, which is a medical painkiller, and a very effective one. And so it has, in some cases, actual real medicinal uses, but it's also highly addictive. And what happens is a bunch of Chinese people, and by a bunch I mean millions of Chinese, get addicted to opium, and they smoke it primarily. And the Chinese government outlaws it, and they put a death penalty on Chinese drug dealers. So if you were caught selling opium in China, they cut your head off publicly. But the British really want to sell their drugs to these barbaric Chinese who cut people's head off for selling, dangerous, addictive drugs to people. And so they go to war over it. And while the British claim it's an issue of free trade and not persecuting British interests and things, the reality is it's all about the money, and they don't really care what the drugs are doing to the Chinese. And so they will fight two relatively brief wars over free trade, and they're the first and second opium wars. I believe one of the students wrote their paper over this. Matter of fact, I know they did. Britain easily defeats the Chinese both times, really. And the treaty that ends these wars is the Treaty of Nanjing, or Nanking, which was done in 1842. It gives Britain the island of Hong Kong on an extremely long-term lease, basically until the British decide to give it up, which they do eventually in the 1990s. They will relinquish Hong Kong back to China. But it forces China to open more ports. At the time, they were only allowed to go into a single port during a certain time of year. Does this sound familiar? And they were very subject to being searched and everything being seized and being treated under Chinese law. Well, the last thing that the Treaty of Nanking does is it gives British subjects extraterritoriality. That's a big fancy word, and what that means is Chinese laws don't apply to British people. Basically what it means. Wherever a British subject went, they took Britain with them in China. And so if what they did was not illegal under British law, they could not be tried in Chinese courts. They could only be tried by British courts. They and again, we're subject really only to British law, not Chinese. Now, if they went off way back into the back of beyond and did something to make somebody mad, they got themselves killed, that could lead to a punitive expedition from Britain. Excuse me, goodness. But they were essentially bulletproof. And it's not fair to China, okay? It's humiliating to China. They're being forced to accept drugs. They're being forced to allow other people who they think of as barbarians to push them around and run the show and do whatever they want and get away with it. They just hated this, and rightfully so. And the Treaty of Nanjing was only the first. China was forced to sign other treaties, which opened more ports to other nations. For example, Tsingtao was open to Germany, which is why Tsingtao, by the way, there's a brand of beer called Tsingtao, and it's a German-style lager, and it's actually fairly decent. The reason for that is that when the Germans went in there were no breweries. And so a German family decided they would start brewing beer in China for all the Germans living in Tsingtao, which is also known as Shanghai. And so you get a German-style beer made in China, of all places. And it's not a terribly bad one. When you get old enough, you can try it. It's just one of those interesting cultural diffusion things. China also has to agree to allow foreign missionaries to come and preach Christianity in China, which was not popular even back then, certainly is not popular with the current communist government. Christian missionaries, well, missionaries of any sort, are not welcome really in China all that much. Anyway, these moves show that the ruling Qing dynasty is getting weaker and weaker, and you have to start worrying about losing that ever popular mandate of heaven and the dynastic cycle turning over yet again. As the Qing dynasty is beginning to look weak, you get what amounts to an attempt to overthrow it in the dynastic cycle. The idea is that they've lost the mandate of heaven, and they want to improve China, and it's known as the Taiping Rebellion. It's probably the single most devastating peasant revolt in history. At least 20 million people die. At least. Maybe as many as 30 or more million people die. It goes on for 14 years. It lasts from 1850 to 1864. So this is from before our Civil War to right at the end of our Civil War. There had been a population explosion and a famine as a result because the population grew faster than the food did. They had widespread government corruption. The Qing dynasty was weak. They had high taxes. They have a series of devastating floods. This is all classic elements of losing the mandate of heaven. which we've talked about several times over this year so far. The rebel leader was a fellow by the name of Hang Shuquan, and he says that he wants to establish a China that is the heavenly kingdom of great peace, which is in Chinese Taiping, and so that's why it's called the Taiping Rebellion. He was definitely influenced by Christianity and wanted to somewhat westernize things. He advocated land reform, gender equality, things like that. It's crazy stuff. And the rebellion almost succeeds, but it doesn't quite. One of the reasons it doesn't is that the Qing get the support of Europeans against the Taiping. Why? Because the Europeans like a weak and divided So after the Taiping Rebellion has failed, the Dowager Empress has, Cixi is her name, has taken power, and she rules until her death in 1908. She actually takes power in 1861, I think it was. Anyway, for about 47 years, she's basically going to rule China. And she's very old-fashioned. She wants to keep things very much the way they are. A Dowager Empress, by the way, is the widow of an emperor and the mother of an emperor to be, basically. So Cixi is going to rule in that capacity until 1908. Her court officials were all Confucian scholars. They liked things the old-fashioned way because that's how Confucianism works, is to look to the past and the ancestors, the good old days, and they don't want any of these newfangled reforms and Western ideas coming in and corrupting the system that they're on top of and might threaten their power. So they're not going to support any of that. Some people will try anyway. Some private individuals will attempt to modernize China anyway. They buy Western guns and hire Western tutors to teach their children, and they develop industries and start building shipyards and all of these things. And so they're struggling to get into the latter part of the early part of the 19th century, really. But their efforts basically fail. They have some local success, but they don't gain widespread acceptance, largely because the government gives them absolutely no support whatsoever, and in fact does their best to tax these industries and things into non-existence. Why? Well, because if they are profitable, then the taxes will make money off of them, and they can't tax the Europeans because those nasty little treaties that the Chinese were forced to sign with the European countries meant that they could not impose taxes on European factories and things. Meanwhile, as China is doing its best to cling to the past, Japan is modernizing rapidly after 1868 during something known as the Meiji Restoration. And they will do everything they can to industrialize. They hire Western tutors and experts, shipbuilders, military, to train and arm and fit out their military and their navy. And they build up into a serious power very, very quickly. It's amazing how fast they do it. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, which we'll hopefully get into. But then they go and they fight a war against the Chinese. Now, China, of course, much bigger than Japan. But in 1894, only call it 25, 26 years after they start modernizing, little old Japan kicks the nonsense out of China in this war. And they sit down and say, yep, we're going to take a bit of China for us as well. And basically the Western powers by the 1890s had all come in and carved up China just like they had Africa into various spheres of influence. And you have a nice little political cartoon here with Queen Victoria and the Kaiser and the Tsar and Marianne for France and a samurai for Japan, and they're sitting there carving up China. The United States does not take a specific territory, but we still want access. And so what we demand is what's known as the open door policy, which simply means that wherever these other powers have access, we demand access as well. Another political cartoon? You betcha. You know, I like these things. And again, it's over China, which is, of course, represented by the central figure, a dragon. And you've got the British lion, the Russian bear, the American eagle with the top hat in the back, the one-headed German eagle, which looks vaguely vulturish, the French rooster, which is a symbol of France for some reason, the Japanese leopard with his samurai sword in his mouth, and the Austrian wolf over here, or pardon me, the Italian wolf and the Austrian double-headed eagle. Because remember, dual monarchy, double-headed. And so their eagle has two heads. And again, looks more vulture-y than eagle-y. And of course, they're fighting over the dead body or sleeping body, perhaps, of the Dragon of China. So China is in a bad shape. And the reformers, the people who want to change things and fix it, they blame those Confucian conservative officials. They don't ever actually get rid of them. They just say that they've got to change. And in 1898, the young Emperor Guangxu launched an era of reform called the 100 Days of Reform. And these were laws designed to modernize China, encourage industry, and things like that. That was supported to a degree by the foreigners. Why? Because if China was more industrial, then they would be able to, guess who would probably dominate those Chinese industries? That's right, the Western powers, the imperialists. And so they were actually kind of in favor of this to a degree. The conservatives, however, will rally, imprison old Guangxu, and restore the Dowager Empress to power, which is why it's only called the 100 Days of Reform. It doesn't last very long. And at the same time, during this time, public sentiment is turning very, very strongly and violently against the foreign devils. A new secret society has been created. The name in Chinese literally translates to the Society of Harmonious Righteous Fists, but they're better known as the Boxers. And these are very traditionalist. Okay, they largely refuse to use firearms or cannons, which is funny because the Chinese invented gunpowder. But hey, they decide that they're going to fight with traditional weapons, and that they'll be victorious that way. And they start attacking foreigners across China. Businessmen and missionaries all around China are killed. And they besieged the Western embassies in the capital of Beijing, or Peking as they used to call it. And so begins the 40 days in Peking, where the guards of the embassies, all the embassies are kind of right next to each other. They're just outside the Forbidden City, which is the imperial palace, which has got a wall around it and everything, and most people aren't allowed in it, hence the name Forbidden City. And that's where the emperor lives, and the Dowager Empress lives there as well. Now, CG is secretly supporting the Boxers. She actually has elements of the imperial army theoretically desert to go help them. The reality is they were acting under orders. And so they besiege these Western embassies, whose guard forces all start working together along with the civilian men, and to hold off the Boxers, because they'll kill everybody in there. They get in, they're going to kill everybody, man, woman, and child. If you're white or if you're Chinese and supporting them, they would kill you. Anyway, so they hold off the Boxers, who way outnumber them, for almost 6 weeks. And in that time, the various nations gather together their forces from all over China and the Pacific and invade China in a multinational force called the Relief Column, including United States Marines, Japanese Army, German Sea Battalion, Italian Bersaglieri, French Marines, British troops, um, just gosh, even some Austrians are involved. I believe the Russians even sent a contingent of Cossacks, if I recall. Anyway, they sent all of these different countries send troops into China to, first of all, go to Peking, save their embassies, and then defeat the Boxers. And they crush the Boxers. They force, as a result, China to make even more concessions and finally convince the Chinese that they're going to have to modernize if they want any kind of chance at running their own affairs. So even though the Boxers failed, that doesn't end the concept of Chinese nationalism. Eventually, Sun Yat-sen and his followers will be calling for a Chinese republic. You see his name spelled two different ways. The more common spelling now is the first. The one in parentheses is the way I grew up, so you may see it either way. So Sun Yat-sen and his nationalist followers call for a new Chinese republic and rebel in order to do so in 1911, a few years after old Cixi dies. But anyway, his Chinese republic is going to be based on what they call the three principles of the people. The first is nationalism. Get the foreign devils out of China, at least as far as running the place. He didn't have a problem doing business with foreign nations. As a matter of fact, he depended on it. Sought help from the United States. They want democracy. Basically, they're going to form a republic. And a livelihood for the people. That's economic security for Chinese people. In other words, we're going to do what we need to do to make sure that the people of China can take care of themselves, that there will be jobs, that there will be food, that there will be the things that they need. So like I said, when Cixi dies in 1908, a 2-year-old boy is left as emperor. His name is Puyi. He will come back later on. A few years later, when he's only 5, China will fall into utter chaos when Sun Yat-sen declares that the Chinese Republic exists. And then he will go on to fight for control of China for the next 37 years, eventually losing the fight in 1948 to the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong, but that's a story for another time. So for now, we're going to be done with this chapter, and we have one left, and then your test will be coming up next week, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye now.